So I am Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, and we're here in my office at NYU, where I am a member of the philosophy department and the English department. And I am a philosopher and also a writer. So this is unusual for me. I don't usually bring up my Orthodox Jewish background. It's something occasionally I've written about very briefly and indirectly, certainly in none of my books. Except I have a book on during Spinoza, in which it comes up somewhat, because I first met Spinoza when I was going to an all-girls, extremely Orthodox high school, in which he was quoted as a kind of a cautionary tale. This is what happens, little girls, when you stray from the path. I said, interesting. Tell me more. Anyway, yes, I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family. We were a family of four. My father was a refugee from Poland. My mother's family came from Hungary. They had suffered greatly during World War II, and that was very, very much part of the family store of stories, and so that was certainly part of my sense of what it was to be Jewish, and that is that we were often victims, and that there was something very, very heroic about prevailing, persisting in the face of exterminating hatred, genocidal hatred, and I loved my family tremendously. My father was a cantor. He had he was a well-educated person. He had in college had majored in German literature, and he lost his love of not only German literature but everything German. And in fact, when I had to study the language German when I went on for my doctorate in philosophy, he refused to even help me with my homework. He never spoke German again, and he fell back on his beautiful voice to support his family, not to support them very well. I grew up very poor. We didn't own houses. We didn't own books in our house. I was taken before the Sabbath every week to the library and got my reading out there. Yeah, and we were four children. I had an older brother. It's kind of a typical Jewish family, and I don't think you have to be Orthodox for this to be true, but the eldest son, he was the only son, in fact, was prized. You know, he was the flower of the family. And then we were three daughters kind of lumped together, and I was the middle of the daughters. And but I adored my family, and I was yeah, I was a very religious, believing child. I prayed every morning, and I obeyed all the laws. And you know, there were questions that I had, and I started very early, and part of them came out of the stories that I heard, particularly about what had happened to my relatives in Europe. And we were all named after, as I found out, dead children. I am actually named after my great-grandmother, Rivka, Rebecca in English. And I mean, everybody died. You know, anybody who wasn't here died. And then during the very short-lived Hungarian Revolution in 1956, some of my Hungarian relatives came out, and I heard stories. Again, I was not supposed to hear them, but I was always sneaking into the room to eavesdrop because it was so fascinating. I heard these stories about being hidden from the bad people, and you know, and all the names that were mentioned of the children who died. That's when I realized, oh, we're all named after these people, and this was it became just an obsession with me, how this God whom I loved, you know, I thought of him as just kind of my father, only bigger and more powerful, but could have allowed this children, and I've been taught there was always a reason for everything, but it just didn't make sense. I mean, that became the obsession, and so when I got taken to the library to get my Sabbath reading, after a while, what I was desperately looking for were the kind of books that would answer this sort of question. And I think I asked the people around me too, but I was not happy ever with the questions. All the questions provoked further questions. So it was that kind of thing. I think, that it was both part of the importance I felt in being Jewish, and the stories that I was raised on, and the heroism, and kind of heroism, and clinging to this identity in the face of that evil. That's, I think, was the seeds of my original doubts. No rebellion against the laws at all. That, in fact, after I became an unbeliever, I continued for most of my life to keep the laws. It wasn't the seductions of the cheeseburger. I have yet to taste a cheeseburger. Yeah, and so it had nothing to do with that kind of thing. Oh, completely. Yeah, completely. That it was, it was that this just, how could it possibly have been? And it was children. It was like the thought of the children who were just so real to me, especially listening to those relatives who had been hidden. They had been hidden. That's how they had survived. And, but it was also, what got through to me, and I was 6 years old when these Hungarian relatives, and they stayed with us, they lived with us until they could get on their feet. What I also gleaned from that was that there were people who believed that, wrong things, believed that my family, who, I loved and I knew were wonderful people, were evil. They should be wiped off the face of the earth, and that they believed false beliefs. And on the basis of believing false beliefs, they caused untold suffering. They became evil. And that it is so incumbent on us. I mean, I was a child, but what I would think was, how do I know that some of my beliefs aren't false? How can I tell? And I actually, as a very little kid, came up with this plan. I was going to go through each of my beliefs one by one and try to see, well, is this true? How do I find out if it's true? And then I realized that was impossible, because there were too many beliefs. And so, but that, you could see how I was sort of being slanted in the direction of philosophy, because this sort of epistemological question of, how do we tell when we know something? What are the good grounds for belief? And that the most important of our beliefs are the beliefs that we, act on and that have an effect on other people. That obsession just came to me very, very early. But all the time, I just wanted to find out how I could justify the beliefs that my family had. I did not want to rebel against my family. That was the last thing. I adored my family. They had suffered, and that was the last thing in the world I wanted. So we're human. We can't judge God's ways. It all makes sense. Often, the afterlife was mentioned. Where the good get their just rewards and the evil get their just rewards. So there, was those sorts of, and for a while that would please me, but then I'd think a little more and I'd find, no, just how do we really know that? You know, like, how do we really know? Is that wishful thinking? I think is what I was struggling with toward that concept. And I kept reading, and my family was, they were in their own way lovers of ideas, and they liked that I read so much. And at one point I got out a book at the library. I can't remember quite how old I was. I was a good deal older, 13 perhaps. And it was Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian. My family was perfectly fine with that. They didn't want me to be a Christian. And Bertrand Russell goes through the main arguments for God's existence, and points out the fallacies in them. And it was particularly his questioning of the moral argument for God's existence, that we need God in order for there to ground morality, that it's moral chaos without it, and what was wrong with that argument. And he basically uses the anti-moral argument that goes back to Plato, to the Euthyphro. And so it's a very, very ancient questioning of that argument. And it was just so satisfying. It was, lights, finally, I understand. No, we don't need God in order to ground morality. What we need is human reason. And that was really very, very satisfying to me, in particular. What he had to say about the moral argument for God's existence. I was then sent to an extremely Orthodox high school, an all-girls high school in Manhattan. We were living in Westchester County, where my dad was a cantor in White Plains, New York, and but I alone was sent to this high school on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and it was really it was terrible high school. We were not supposed to go on to college, and it was, the girls got engaged and married very early, and I hated that high school. We had our Hebrew studies in the morning and our secular studies in the afternoon. It was an accredited school, so they had to teach certain things. If you were on the academic track, there was also a commercial track. I was on the academic track, and we had to take the New York State Regents exam. So we did have to learn, for example, evolution in my biology class, but the principal, who was also a rabbi, came into class in the beginning of the term to say that we were going to have to learn this for the Regents exam. It was all false. It contradicted the Torah. Learn it. Write it on your exam, forget it all. And again, lights, when I learned the theory of evolution, and it was very, very satisfying explanations for how life had evolved, with this just beautiful set of ideas. It was so fully explanatory. Well, all of my science classes were like that, but the having to learn the theory of evolution, and maybe particularly because the rabbi principal had come in and said it was false, I was particularly interested in it. Again, sort of lights went on, and I knew that somehow or other I was going to get myself a really good education. This was the joy of trying to understand things and make progress with one's understanding. This was the joy I wanted for my life. I was like a heroine from a Russian novel. I was battling constantly, I was I could have been written by Dostoevsky, right? I was a believer. I was then not a believer. I was struggling. I was, it was all very passionate. And I remember actually into college, when I did manage to get myself to college, to Barnard College, which was an all-women's college. It still is, actually, part of Columbia University. But I remember I took a course on mysticism. It was mysticism of all sorts. And I remember reading, some mystic. Actually, it was The Interior Castle by Saint Teresa of Avila, and sort of crying desperately because I had lost this intimacy with God, and it was just, feeling very bad about it. And that was the last time I ever had such an emotion. After that, I sort of know I was past that. Beyond, that was no longer, I was no longer struggling with trying to have religious faith. That was done with. But it was drawn out. Oh, very much so. I got married very young, of course. When I was in that awful high school, I got engaged. And I got married to my first husband, who is Orthodox but a brilliant physicist. And he is but Orthodox and keeps everything. And he knew I was not a believer at that point. Orthodoxy is interesting because lack of belief is not taken, it's not the worst thing in the world as long as you keep the laws. And so that was the deal. I was going to keep the laws, which was fine with me, as long as I had the freedom to think as I wanted. That became a bit of a problem in the marriage as well. But, it seemed, that it was so very important to my family that I marry somebody Orthodox. I was in love with him. And, and he was appropriate for my family. And I always wanted my family to be able to be in my house and eat in my house, and so keeping kosher and all of these things, that was fine. It became extremely inconvenient when I became a professor and had to miss classes for so many holidays that nobody else has even heard of, right? So I think sometimes my colleagues thought I was making them up. What? Shemini Atzeres? What? What's that? I was constantly missing classes for that, and couldn't work on the Sabbath, and, couldn't write, and with being a Jewish housewife, rushing home to prepare for the Sabbath and, all of those things. But yeah, I kept that up for a very long time. But I made it very clear to my family that I was doing it for them because I love them. I didn't want to be accused of being a hypocrite. And I didn't want to be a hypocrite, rather. I didn't want to, my actions spoke belief. And that was always a problem for me because I didn't believe, but I worked it out. It was complicated, and then when I became a much more public person, when I started to publish books, it became much more difficult because, again, I couldn't really say what I believed. It's one of the reasons I started writing fiction. My characters could play out my beliefs in a way that I really couldn't. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons. I don't know. There are many, many reasons, and I don't really know why. Since I'm trained as a philosopher, I started to write fiction, but I did. To my family, yes, to my family, but it was because we lived within a Jewish community, and then I had children. They were sent to a religious day school, and it had to be private because it would be a disgrace for my family. It would be a humiliation. The community means so much when you're an Orthodox Jewish person. And my kids were being raised as Orthodox. Their friends were Orthodox. Somehow people knew. They didn't quite trust me. But I did walk the walk. I didn't talk the talk. I just didn't talk, really, about it. I lived a double life for most of my life, for so very much of my life. Until both my parents had died. And I knew this about Spinoza, who I had first come into contact with in that awful school, and but that he, heretic that he was, had kept quiet about it all until both his parents had died. And I decided then, I know how I was 15 when I heard about that, and I decided I'm going to do exactly what Spinoza did. I'm going to think my thoughts and be free in my mind. but I'm not going to shame my parents. I'm not going to do anything to cause them grief. You know, I love them very much. And so I would tell them, and that was fine. They thought that eventually I'll come around. And if you do, it's kind of behaviorist view, if you do the actions, that's as good as belief. And, you know, you can't force belief, but you can force the actions. And eventually you will believe, you know, but it didn't work.
At least you're trying.
You're trying, yeah. And even, you know, my very, very, very religious rest of the family, or my nephews, and who are very Orthodox, they don't. I never feel as if they judged me harshly, and because they knew that for most of my life I did this, and it didn't take. But you know, maybe they feel a little sorry for me for that. I don't know, but they know that it wasn't to go off and be a hedonist and you know, have, you know, fun. I was having no fun whatsoever. So you know, I'm close with all of them. I'm close with all of my religious relatives, and I never feel that they judge me harshly. Yes, I love the Sabbath. I'm a workaholic, and I was forced not to work. I loved, I mean, it was often very difficult because I couldn't work, and you know, my writing couldn't get done, and it was a very typical Jewish household. The woman did everything with very little help, and but I loved, you know, after the ordeal of having to get everything ready for the Sabbath, having come home from, you know, a full week of work. You know, as soon as it was sundown, in which we counted to the moment of sundown, you know, 4:13, everything stopped, and I would collapse with my kids on the couch, and we would just have this wonderful family time, and I would be completely available to them in a way that, you know, I wasn't when I was, you know, going about my work. And so I loved that. I both loved and hated the communal life. I felt trapped by the community, and I found it very narrow-minded, and there were very few people, if anybody, I could talk to within the community, especially the women. But in hard times, they're very supportive. We went through a whole series of deaths in my family, and very painful deaths, and they were really there for us, you know, taking care of us and bringing us food, and you know, so it's something that's lost in this great cosmopolitan world, which I love and I revel in. But you know, it's not that kind of, you know, the insularity is both good and bad. I only really enjoyed it in hard times, but it was there. Yeah. So yeah, for a great part of my life, I lived, you know, doing everything but believing what I believed and didn't believe, and my family knew this, and you know, for the most part, I know they wanted it to be otherwise, and sometimes would try to convince me, but it was. I think everybody came to terms with this, and I've often, after I left it, after both my parents had died, and you know, and I lived as I actually believed, outwardly and inwardly. It was great relief. But I wondered how many, even of the people who were close and dear to me, had a similar bifurcation between how they acted and what they really thought about. And I had a really dramatic experience with somebody in my family, a younger member of my family, very Orthodox black hat, and extremely brilliant and very knowledgeable of the Talmud. And he's my go-to guy whenever I need to know something technical about Judaism, about the Talmud, and I wrote an email to him asking him a question, a technical question. He said, "Oh, wait, well, and Rebecca, why would you possibly want to know this?" And I wrote back to him and said, "Oh, you don't want to know why your heretical aunt wants to know this. You know, it's for some purpose of which you wouldn't approve." And he wrote back and he said, it's very piercing to me. He said, "I'm disappointed in you. I thought you knew me better than that. There's probably nothing that you think that I don't think too." And I realized that he too was, thinking his thoughts, and they were completely separate from the kind of life that he was living. And I think that is, that's something out of loyalty to the family, loyalty to the history on which we were raised, for whatever reasons. This was the accommodation that he had come to, and the accommodation that I lived with for a very long time. Oh, right. So that was, a time when it was, when I was in college. I didn't have children yet, and so, that was a different thing. Well, why? I mean, well, I had felt, you feel a certain way about the world when you feel that there is a creator and that you matter to the universe. There were two stories sort of compressed there.
Right.
There was when I was no longer at all a believer and I was just going through the motions, and there's that, and I think I've spoken a bit about that. It's, it was inconvenient, but it was worth it for the sake of my family, and it's like it became much harder when I became a public person, much harder, because I was spoken of as an Orthodox writer, and interviewed as an Orthodox writer. I was not my inner world, exactly as I am today, an atheist and a humanist, and I would much more identify myself as a secular humanist, but I couldn't say anything that would blow my cover and embarrass my family, and bring shame on my family. So that was difficult. It was a constant negotiation. How do I keep my integrity and not, do anything for which my family is going to feel very bad? Now, maybe my family was wrong to do that to me. Maybe they were. Maybe they should have allowed me. I know they thought that they were doing it for my own good. They're believers. And there is this asymmetry, I think, between believers and unbelievers. I would never ask a religious person, well, act as if you don't believe. Violate these things that you think are true. And eat the cheeseburger, right? Wear the bikini, right? All this sort. I would never feel I had the right to do that. That if they want to persist in those beliefs, but there's a real asymmetry between and even the a-religious feel it. So to me, maybe it has something to do with my upbringing and my ultimate, passivity that I had been raised in. But for me, this made perfect sense, and that's the way I did it, And it was difficult. There were, I'm kind of whitewashing it now, but yeah, there were many times when I felt tormented by, I don't want to mislead anybody, I don't want to say anything that's wrong, but I don't believe, but I don't want to bring shame on my family. It was very difficult. The other thing, when I was still in the throes of trying to become a believer, why was that so important to me? Well, first of all, I didn't want to be alienated from my family. I didn't want to be alienated from my community. And the community was not as important to me. It was my family. And I wanted to think and to feel as they did. And it was kind of a cozier world when I believed in God. It was a morally baffling world, but it was a cozier world, and I knew that I mattered, God cared, and I mattered in some large cosmic sense, or I thought that, um, yeah, and that it mattered that I had been born into this particular group, and I had a life script that I had to play out. I didn't have to make it up for myself. I knew what was required for me in order to be a good person. All of those questions were answered for me, and I tried to cling to it for as long as I could, and that's why I cried. That last time I ever wept tears over this, and then I decided to embrace it, and that I was going to try to figure out to the best of my ability, read as much as I could, educate myself as best as I could, expose myself to all the great ideas that are out there, that was going to be my great adventure, to try to partake in the advancement of those ideas in whatever small way I could, that was going to be my adventure. And it was riskier, and it was, I had to make up the script for myself, but there it is.